This is EVE Online. EVE Online is a massively multiplayer online game that has probably best been known for articles about massive space battles with tens of thousands of players, or stories about in-game conmen screwing over their allies after years of friendship, and just about the most boring Twitch streams you have ever seen. EVE Online is interesting for a bigger reason though, that is often overlooked. That is its amazingly realistic economy. Almost every item in this game, from rounds of ammunition to space stations, are player made. And by player made, I mean that raw materials are mined by player corporations, then transported by players from logistics corporations to open markets where the materials are traded to players that will again transport these materials back to space factories, where they will be turned into usable items and once again hauled back to an open market, where they'll be sold to an end user who will probably do this with it. To get a sense of how diverse industry and economics is in EVE, this is a flowchart. It's a condensed version of popular professions that people can do in this game. Sure, other games have crafting that is almost as intricate as this, but no other game combines that with the level of player involvement seen here. Throughout that entire process we just saw, not one NPC was involved. Every trading partner was a real player, and this means that EVE Online has a surprisingly realistic and genuinely fascinating economy. Now, there is so much I could talk about in this video when it comes to the crazy capitalist market of EVE, but I really want to focus on one aspect in particular, and that is player-owned sovereign territory. Everything in EVE takes place in this fictional galaxy called New Eden. At the centre of this galaxy is Empire-controlled territory. This is a relatively safe zone for new players where there are consequences for engaging in aggressive acts. That doesn't mean that aggressive acts don't happen, but there are consequences. The further out you go on this map though, the more you get into no man's land. There really isn't anything supplied out here, but it is free for anybody to claim and hold as their own. This means that groups of players can assemble into alliances and basically start their own in-game nations outside the control of any static game restrictions. Now, a big distinction that I must make is when I say in-game nations, I am not talking about a gaming clan with a clubhouse and their own banner. I am talking about a group of tens of thousands of players that live within a defined border with a player-run military, a player-run industrial sector, laws, diplomacy, capital cities, defined leadership structures, and most crazy of all, social security. I'm not kidding. Most of these large sovereign alliances have systems in place to make sure that all of their members can afford ships to fly in, because the more pilots that they have in space contributing to industry or flying in their defensive fleets, the better. The biggest of all of these in-game nations is a coalition called the Imperium. This group has everything that we have seen earlier, and this one even comes complete with its own space Donald Trump. An outspoken, loved or hated bombastic leader who does really stupid stuff when he gets on stage. But that's a whole other thing. The most amazing part of all of this for economics nerds like myself is something called the Monthly Economic Report. This is a detailed report produced by the game developers CCP that details all manner of things from the EVE economy, from trade balances of regions to the consumer price index of in-game items. And yes, we are still talking about a video game here. Something really cool that this allows us to do with a bit of engineering is to work out the GDP of one of these in-game player nations, both in terms of in-game currency and the real-life dollar equivalent. A quick reminder is that GDP is normally used to work out the size of real-life nations' economies, and it is calculated using this formula. GDP equals household spending, plus government spending, plus investment, plus net exports. The Imperium draws its borders around this area of the map, centralizing on an in-game region called Delve. The borders do overflow into surrounding regions like Quirios, but a vast majority of the Imperium's trade and industry takes place here. Delve is also where their capital city is located, so for the sake of simplicity, we will just look at Delve. If we look at the monthly economic report for January 2019, we can work out everything we need to know to get a GDP figure. Starting with household spending, the total market trade in Delve in this period was 48.6 trillion ISK. ISK being the in-game currency. To add on to this, there were contracts traded in this region for an additional 32 trillion ISK. Contracts in this game are normally used to trade higher value one-off items, but for all intents and purposes, it's the same as trading on an open market. This gives us a combined household spending figure of 90.6 trillion ISK for this region for this period. Next up is government spending. In this case, the alliances of the Imperium are the government. Now, this actually cannot be determined by the monthly economic report because unfortunately it keeps those figures private. But remember when I was talking about their welfare systems that ensure that everybody has a ship to fly? Well, using this we can reverse engineer a rough guesstimate of how much the Imperium spends on this service. Every ship destroyed in EVE Online is listed on this third-party website that has some amazing tools available to filter through who it belonged to and how it was destroyed. By looking at this period, we can determine that about 2 trillion ISKs worth of Imperium ships were destroyed, and that would be eligible for a ship replacement welfare program. This is admittedly the roughest figure in this calculation, because the Imperium does spend a little bit more money on in-game items despite this welfare, and not all ships destroyed are necessarily eligible for this welfare. But I am happy to agree on a rough 2 trillion ISK figure for this period. Next up, investment. Now, in EVE, this figure is roughly a function of normal consumption. The one thing EVE Online does not have is a functioning financial securities market. There are certainly players who will purchase commodities in this game as a long-term investment, but this kind of transaction would be indistinguishable from normal trade. And so this figure is just combined with the figure from household spending. If any EVE players know how to better determine the breakdown of investment versus normal spending, please let me know, because it is genuinely very interesting and I could not figure it out. Finally, we have net exports. Delve, the primary home of the Imperium, imported 5.8 trillion ISKs worth of goods during this period, and exported 9.2 trillion ISKs worth. Now, this gave it a net exports figure of 3.4 trillion ISK. So, now we have all the figures. Household spending of 90.6 trillion ISK, government spending of 2 trillion ISK, and net exports of 3.4 trillion ISK. We are left with a GDP figure for this period of 96 trillion ISK. Now, remembering that this was only for 1 month of the year, we can get an annual GDP figure by assuming that this month was about average, which, looking back on historical data, is the case, and multiplying by 12, giving us an annual GDP figure of 1.152 quadrillion ISK. Okay, cool. That's a big number, but what does it mean in terms of real-life money? Well, in-game ISK can actually be purchased from the game developers through an in-game item called Plex. 500 Plex extends an account's premium subscription to the game for 30 days, and sells for about $12 US. In-game, these 500 Plex are worth about 2 billion ISK. By this calculation, in real-world dollars, the GDP of the Imperium is just under $7 million US, with one big asterisk. And that is, while real money can be used to buy in-game money cannot be sold for real money, at least not with the blessing of the game developers. But when there is a will, there is a way, and shady sites do operate for EVE players looking to sell their in-game money. This black market ISK is significantly less valuable, but in the interest of fairness, if the GDP was to be based on this tradable currency pair, the GDP of the Imperium would be closer to about $3 million US per year. Beyond this, it must be remembered that the Imperium is only one entity in an expansive game with hundreds of entities vying for economic dominance, and so everything we have seen here is just a small part of an even greater and more intricate video game economy. EVE Online is not a game for everyone. If the idea of looking at contracts and trade spreadsheets and market graphs doesn't appeal to you, there are definitely more exhilarating ways to spend your time online. But I really love stories about EVE Online because while it is absurd to say that it in any way reflects a real-life national economy, it does genuinely have some incredible similarities in intricacies that give us a glimpse into what an economy would look like if the rules were removed and the place was run by internet spaceship meme lords. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps out. As always, I've left my email in the video description for any questions, and I do my very best to reply to any comments that you leave.